Please note that the content of this podcast reflects the personal opinions and experiences of the speakers. It should not be considered medical advice. For professional guidance, consult with a relevant expert. SIA has no affiliation to any commercial entities spoken about or highlighted as part of the content of this podcast series. SIA is not in a position to endorse or recommend individual products or entities. Participants' views are based entirely on their own experiences and they are speaking as separate entities. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fourth pod, Adventure Travel. I'm personally quite excited for the conversation today because adventure travel is something that can often feel out of reach and impossible for people with disabilities and spinal cord injuries. It was something that I was scared I would never be able to experience again when I was first injured. But before we jump in, a quick recap as this is the fourth pod. So far, we've discussed planning, mental preparation, and everyday travel. If you haven't, please do go back and give them a listen. We've had some great guests and some brilliant conversations. Now, looking ahead to today, I'm joined by two awesome guests, Suzanne and Rob, who bring with them a load of experiences from backpacking around the world to accessible tree houses in the Amazon jungle. Both have a list of travels to be jealous of. But as we'll get into it, adventure is very individual and you certainly don't need to be going to the extremes. Adventure means very different things to different people and all depends what you want to get out of a trip. And it can be far closer to home. I was actually lucky enough to have a mini adventure on the weekend staying in Snowdonia National Park and getting out for some awesome mountain biking with my wife and son, which was great fun. However, enough about me. Let's hear from the important people and get the conversation started. So, Suzanne, I'm going to be coming to you first. Would you be able to give everyone a quick introduction, who you are and your favourite place you've travelled to?
Yes. Hello, my name is Suzanne. I am based in North Devon and my job is that I work for Airbnb as the accessibility lead. So I work with all different teams within Airbnb to innovate to make travel more accessible for people with disabilities and accessibility needs. And my favourite place to travel is a little place up in Scotland.
Go on, where is it? So do you not want to reveal it in case it gets overwhelmed?
It's called Ballindarloch. It's up near the Cairngorms. It's on the River Spey. I go up fishing every year with my family.
Oh, beautiful. I was up in Scotland last year. It's a beautiful area that I didn't quite realise. Incredible.
It's stunning. And one of my favourite things about Scotland is it's drivable. It's quite a long way, but I love being able to have my car and being able to go out and explore. I'm planning to explore much more of Scotland.
I love that. And Rob, would you be able to give everyone a quick introduction, who you are and your favourite place you've travelled to?
So I'm Rob. I am now the CEO of the Active Hands Company. So we make products for people with reduced hand function, many of which I use on my travels to help me overcome a few issues with hand function. So I live in the Midlands. I've got 2 kids now and I've travelled for many years in my younger years as a kind of backpacker traveller and latter with kids in tow on camper van holidays, motorhome holidays, that kind of thing. My favourite place to travel is probably a couple of islands, one in Fiji called Bounty Island where there's a little reef just offshore, and one is Gili Trawangan, which is in Indonesia just off the coast of Lombok, where you can swim with sea turtles just straight off the beach. So somewhere hot and sunny with some sand and some sea is probably great for me.
Sounds incredible and idyllic, and I'm going to be Googling straight after we get off this conversation. And Rob, what's your level of injury?
Yeah, so my injury is C5-6. I'm an incomplete injury, so I'm a wheelchair user all the time, but I can, at a push, do a couple of steps with the aid of crutches or something to lean on, but not very easily.
Okay, thanks for that. And we've had a brief chat before and you've kind of shared some of your incredible journeys that you've been on, but wanted to dive in with the first question of what does adventure travel mean to you?
I think it probably varies over where you are in life. So adventure travel for me when I first started traveling was backpacking on a low budget, traveling for months at a time sometimes, and just far-flung, difficult to reach or just interesting locations for me. Something which pushed my boundaries a bit, put me off the beaten track, and seemed like an adventure. Seemed like it actually was difficult, and therefore that was part of the fun of it. That was part of the enjoyment, to challenge myself to do it. And that means different things now. So I think the challenge and the adventure now much as I'd like to get to those places again with two young children, the challenge and the adventure is sometimes a bit different, but also can be intriguing and really enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm learning how different travel is now with a 1-year-old in tow. It's a whole new ball game, right? I suppose looking back into those early days after your injury, it sounds like you were seeking that challenge, and I suppose you wanted to test your capabilities a bit. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I've always liked to push the limits of what I do and challenge myself to see what I can manage. So my actual first travels was actually my biggest one. So it was with my best mate, and we travelled for 9 months through Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands, and then North America. And that was my longest travels. It was all on a budget, and it was a kind of one large rucksack between the two of us, and then a couple of day bags to carry all of our kit. And we were away for 9 months. So it was quite a logistical planning one, but also we did a lot of it as we went around. So, planned the flights, but didn't plan any accommodation and stuff in advance and just sort of jammed it on the backpacker route. And that was something I really enjoyed as well, being a bit flexible and spontaneous.
Wow, I have so many questions that are jumping to mind, but I suppose that for me feels like it would take real confidence. Where did you even start? You've obviously booking things on the fly a little bit, but how did you even pack a bag for that? I'm thinking when I came out of hospital, anywhere I'd travel, I'd be with hundreds of bags around me, let alone just trying to break that down into one.
I mean, this was my first trip, so we did do things which weren't right and we modified that as we went along. But you work out ways as a backpacker traveler, you've just got to cut down on everything. So going to hot places for a start was much easier because your clothing is much smaller and you need less thick things. Just cutting down what you pack, making sure you've got space for medical bits, your catheters, leg bags, etc., whatever you need. So a lot of that stuff I had to send out to places along the route. So I would take enough for maybe 2 or 3 months and then send stuff to either random people that I knew, or I think it used to be at the time a post office service where you could send it to a post office and they would keep it there until you arrived to pick it up. So I did a lot of that, and things like not taking a towel. I would take like a sarong to dry myself with. Just little ways that you could find to economise the bulk of what you would take. Regarding the actual booking, this was 25 years ago or something that I initially went away on these travels, so a long time ago, but you didn't have the opportunity really to book via the internet or anything. You get on the backpacker route, you would turn up at a hostel and see if they had spaces, see if it was accessible enough to use, and that was really part of the fun of travel for me. Working out what I could manage, what I couldn't manage. Like I said, being able to take a few steps, if I could lean on my mate's shoulders or he could hoik a wheelchair up a couple of steps, that kind of thing really made things a lot easier for the accessibility side of travel. It means I could manage to cope in most situations, but it was still hard work a lot of the time, and there were places which we found which just weren't accessible or weren't working for me, so we had to find alternatives. But that was part of the fun of it, really. I like the challenge of not knowing where we would be and sort of planning bits as we could along the way.
I love that. And I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more in a few minutes. But Suzanne, I wanted to come to you and ask the same question of what does adventure travel mean to you?
Well, firstly, I think Rob's travels are so impressive.
Yeah, I know,
Mine
right?
are a lot less hardcore than that, I think. For me, I was always very adventurous before my accident. I always loved being out in nature. I traveled to some great places. I went to Indonesia, South Africa, New Zealand. I had done a lot of traveling and I've always loved the outdoors. I love going off the beaten track, just exploring. So for me, having my accident and suddenly realizing that that was going to be quite challenging was a bit of a shock to the system. And I think I had my accident when I was out in Morocco and I was just living this very carefree lifestyle. I was pretty young still. And so I think I became very risk averse and very aware that actually maybe I had been a bit too carefree and relaxed about putting myself in situations. And so I sort of retreated a bit. And so for me, I think adventure travel now is less hardcore than Rob. I like smaller activities. So I still love being outside in nature, but maybe it's more for like a few hours rather than 9 months of backpacking. So for me, accommodation and places to stay can very much be the destination in itself. Finding somewhere that is still out in nature. I stayed in this great cabin in Yosemite and I could still go out and do some trails, but I could then go back and cook nice food and have a nice bed and sit on the sofa. So yeah, I'm definitely not as hardcore, but I still love to surf. I love being outside and I love to push myself. And I think for me now, adventure travel is still pushing myself outside my comfort zone, but also still remaining quite cautious and quite aware that quite precious about not damaging myself or not putting myself in situations where I'm super uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And one line you said there that I think would resonate with a lot of people is that risk aversion after sustaining an injury and going through that long journey of rehabilitation, right? And wanting to mitigate the risk of being back there again. And I suppose you touched on a little bit of some of those reasons why you ended up getting back into adventurous travel and getting out there. But was there a moment that you felt, actually, this is something I really need for me? What was that trigger? Because that risk aversion piece can become quite overwhelming, I think.
Yeah, I think it definitely can become. You want to wrap yourself in cotton wool, and depending on the type of family and friends that you have around you, sometimes they can wrap you in cotton wool. And I think my family very much didn't want to. I was early 20s, I have a very close family. And so they very much encouraged me to want to do things, to try new things, but sort of within a safe environment. And I think a really key part is finding people that you feel safe with, you feel secure with, especially in those early days if you do want to go on trips. And so we took a family holiday to Cornwall, which is somewhere we'd been going since I was really young. And we used to all stay in a big house together, and it wasn't accessible, so it's sort of harder, but I think it just becomes really important to try little things. And then I started working in the accessible travel space, first for an accessible travel startup and now for Airbnb. And being surrounded constantly by, in this case, accessible travel accommodation options. I'm so immersed in the world of travel. You see what other people are doing. You see the incredible accessible adventures people are having and places people are staying. If you've had the bug for travel before, it really ignites it. And it makes you realize, like, I want to go there. Even hearing Rob say about his favorite place, I think both you and I, Ollie, now are like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. I quite fancy swimming with turtles. So you can't help yourself. And there's a lot of disabled travel influencers now who, again, are doing incredible things and showing what's possible. I think, especially when I was first injured, there was less visibility and you didn't really necessarily know what was out there. You really had to do a lot of hard work yourself to maybe try something. But now there's quite a lot of things that are already made to be accessible, and you just book and go and do and enjoy.
There's so much social media around. Like when I first travelled, I used to have to go to an internet cafe every few weeks and send an email home to say how I was getting on. But now the social media is just everywhere, and I think wherever you are all over the world, you can see what other people are doing and you can show what you're doing yourself so much more easily. So therefore you can see what other people can manage to get up to and the little tricks that they use to get over the obstacles.
Those tips and tricks are game changers. But I think it's also around Rob, thinking back from kind of your initial story, the way you would approach that massive trip that you did. Actually, you had to become quite uncomfortable with the uncomfortable. That kind of lack of control and planning and things like that, where actually there's now loads of opportunity to actually plan, kind of get ahead of it and still have an awesome adventure, but have a bit more confidence in where you're going. Would love to hear from Suzanne. What do you do? Like, you spoke about going to places to have kind of a base and things like that. What do you do when you're kind of doing that planning bit for your next adventure?
I'm very fortunate. I get to travel a lot as part of my job, and so I always try and make sure I can have some fun on these trips as well. And yeah, having a good base for me is super important. I don't travel lightly. Again, dissimilar to Rob, I could not put stuff in a backpack. I travel with 2 big suitcases. I always start, no huge surprise, looking on Airbnb for accommodation that hopefully is going to be kind of unique and fun, like the cabin I found in Yosemite. I've stayed in some other great places as well that sort of immerse yourself in an area. And I think hotel rooms can sometimes be a bit sterile. You could be anywhere. You're sort of looking out over a car park or something. So to find somewhere where you are immersed in nature or something is really exciting. So that's always my starting point. Accommodation is a huge part for me. And then I will sort of look for inspiration from, other people that have traveled somewhere, whether they have a disability or not. If I'm going somewhere, I went to Joshua Tree, I want to be able to see all the things that everyone sees there, and then just working out, are they going to be accessible? If they're not that accessible, is it a risk? Is it something that's manageable? Some things are created to be accessible. Some things are kind of workable, depending on who you're with or what compromise you're willing to take. I want to do what everyone else does when they're going to a new place. And so to me, it's really important to make the most of it. But I am a huge planner. I travel a lot with my friend Jack. He is pretty good at planning activities. Normally I do accommodation, he does activities. It sort of works quite well. And then he's also great at pushing me more out of my comfort zone. I'll be like, oh, I don't know if we should do this. He's like, come on, it's going to be worth it. We sort of have this phrase, is the juice worth the squeeze? And it's sort of like, if, it might not be great to get somewhere. We were in Oregon and there was a waterfall that I really wanted to see, but it was up quite a steep incline. I had my tri ride. I hate to have help from people. I love to be independent. So I knew that he was going to have to push me a little bit, but he was like, come on, it's going to be worth it. And it was worth it. I had a few dodgy moments on the path going up and down, but in that case, and in most of the cases that we have had a few minor disasters, but on the whole, if the juice is worth the squeeze, then we'll do it.
Love that. And Rob, you mentioned like using social media and things like that to kind of see what other people are doing and building up a bit more of a picture before you maybe travel, or kind of getting those ideas going. Are there any other things that you do now to kind of help with that planning aspect?
Yeah, I suppose now there's a vast amount of research you can do before you go anywhere. When I did most of my travels, that was less available. You would get a Lonely Planet guide, basically. I sound really old now, don't I? An actual physical book, and leaf through the pages and work out which hostels were where and what the routes were between them. Apart from that, I think actually the best way is just talking to people, whether that's other travellers, particularly on the backpack scene. There's so much time spent with other travellers in buses and transport and waiting around in hostels and stuff and doing activities, that you just naturally talk to each other. You know, say, oh, I've gone in this direction. I went to this place, which is a real highlight, and if you ask the right questions, you can fairly easily get a handle on whether something's going to be accessible or manageable, even from asking questions to people who have no real interest in or experience in accessibility. There's a few questions you can ask them that if they can remember things well enough, you might be able to work out how you can do it. I also found in the backpacker travel world, people are really happy to help with activities and also getting a few rucksack on and off and helping you get on and off a bus or whatever it is. I like to be independent, but I like to, it feels to me like I can give someone the gift of helping me. Like I know how much it means to me if I can help someone else do something which is really going to help them in their life, and will really be appreciative of that. And I think as disabled people, we often so caught up on being independent that actually you miss out on an opportunity of giving someone the gift of helping you. And much as I'd like to do everything on my own, sometimes I can't, particularly with my hand function. I've got really reduced hand function. Often I'll ask someone just to do something because I can't do it with my hands. Asking a stranger to do something to help you, I think probably if you can take that on board yourself and be happy with that, you probably have enlightened their day and made them feel really good about themselves. And as long as you're not doing something which is going to put them out and make it hard, you're not being annoying to them, actually I think it's actually quite a benefit to give someone that job to do and to feel good about being able to help you.
I love that, Rob. And actually, you're kind of making me think about myself. I think I let my ego get in the way far too much when thinking about kind of help and that stubbornness of not wanting help.
As disabled people, I think we often are so caught up with being independent and not asking for help that we overlook that it's a kind of a two-way thing. Asking for help is not necessarily a negative thing, and giving somebody help is often a really positive and life-affirming thing to do.
It is. And I think like I can testify from that from being on the flip side, right? And I do a lot of work in the charity space, and it is one of the most rewarding things going, right? Helping other people. But I've never actually thought about it from that side of things. So thank you for sharing that perspective. I feel like I need to go away and rethink things a little bit now and get my ego back in the box. So thanks for that. One of the things I was actually reflecting on a little bit as well is when thinking about planning a trip, for me, certainly, I think when we're talking about adventure, it's those luxuries that I want to have as well that will make it a nicer trip for me. For me, toilets are a big one, right? I always like to know that I can get to a toilet and I'm not going to be having to do anything on a bed. When I'm going on holiday, that's quite important. Are there any things for you, Suzanne? Obviously, roof over your head and kind of wanting the warmth of a fire after kind of going out is something, but are there anything else like for you that jumped to mind?
Yeah, I think I'm similar to you. I think bathroom is very important, sort of somewhere, obviously being able to use the toilet, a shower as well. I like to shower regularly.
Yeah,
Again, I think another reason why I'd be terrible at backpacking. I like to have a shower, feel clean, feel fresh. I think again, having a washing machine, things like that. I really like those home comforts. I really appreciate them, being able to cook, have a fridge, that kind of thing. Any travel I do to sort of feel like a home away from home, that is important for me to be able to enjoy myself. So knowing that I'm coming back to, a bed, a shower, all of that kind of thing at the end of a day makes me then, I guess, feel a bit more brave or confident in the day that if it is going to be a long day, again, thinking about some of the trips I've done where I'm out exploring in the US, I go to quite a lot of national parks because they're really accessible and sort of trying different trails or, doing all sorts. I also love surfing, so I go on sort of surf trips and being in the water, knowing that then at the end of the day, when you're feeling a bit exhausted, your shoulders are a bit knackered, you can have a hot shower, sit on the sofa, cook some food, and then hopefully get a good night's sleep. That to me is very important. And again, possibly keeping my ego in check as well. I love to be very independent as well. I hate asking for help. So I like to have stuff that I'm able to do, or I don't have to get someone to push me up a steep ramp or bump me up some steps or something. I like my space to be very accessible for me and to sort of work for my needs.
Yeah. And Rob, kind of putting that question over to you. And I imagine that's changed a little bit from kind of when you were backpacking to now when you've got a family. It'd be great maybe to hear those two perspectives.
I think when I was backpacking, it comes with the territory, doesn't it? You lose the comfort to gain the sort of cheapness of it, essentially. You're often in multiple bedrooms and it's uncomfortable travel sometimes, or it's just less comfortable. That kind of brings a camaraderie with it and a closeness with other people, which I really enjoy. There's ways of, you're often in the water, in the sea, and a lot of hostels that you stay in are kind of fairly decent. May not be the most comfortable bed, and that probably as I get older, the more comfortable bed is the thing that is more important to me. This is one of those things where as life changes, your priorities change as well. So now I'm not off backpacking all the time. So when I travel with the family, the kind of ease of entertaining the kids and having them be able to sleep properly so they're not tired all the time is really important. Yeah, so it does definitely change as life moves on.
And I think sometimes bits of different equipment and things like that can make a massive difference when you're away as well. Rob, were there any things that you had in your rucksack that were game changers for when you were away and you were coming up against a whole range of situations?
I think I set myself up for the most possibilities of being able to get out of any difficult situation. So my wheelchair itself is like a box frame rather than a sort of cantilever frame. So it's a bit more robust for being thrown around. I've got off-road wheels on my chair and the sort of quite chunky front casters. I also have like an under-seat box, which I store loads of things in. So I'd have a little tiny pump and a spare inner tube and a little toolkit and all these things that I could just carry around in case of emergency. Things always happen along the way. You get a puncture or you encounter a problem or you haven't got a piece of equipment. And carrying all your sort of medical bits is always difficult. And there's always an extreme or a small time when you have to work out ways to get around things. So biggest issue that I had once, I suppose, was in Indonesia. We were going down to a waterfall in Bali and I had to get onto my crutches because it was so steep and muddy to get down there. This was like getting towards sunset. We just got down to this waterfall, me and my mate, been in the water, come back up the hill, and I was on crutches and he was sort of pushing my chair and I could only make it a little way, but we were getting towards the darks, the sun was coming down and he went to help me up a particularly steep and slippery bit. And actually he let go of my chair and it rolled off the edge of a cliff and bounced. We sort of heard it as the sun was going down, bouncing it in the undergrowth downhill quite a long way. Thinking this is like halfway through our trip, what on earth are we going to do? I've just lost the big mobility bit of equipment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's quite serious. Things that happen on your travels and you think, we are buggered now.
That's up the list, right, of worst case scenarios. Yep.
So we had hired a little Jeep. We managed to get our way back to the Jeep just about. Went back to accommodation and it was just, what do we do? So we went back to accommodation. There's no way we could get this. It had gone right down the cliff. And then the next morning we came back really early. We'd found out the Indonesian word for wheelchair, which I think was kursi roda or something. And we'd managed to get a load of ropes. So we went back to the same place and my mate lowered himself sort of down this undergrowth. It wasn't a cliff essentially, I suppose it was a very, very steep slope. Trees were just about growing out of it.
Yeah.
So he lowered himself off into the darkness, into the undergrowth in the morning. and got to the end of the rope and was like, well, okay, I can't find it yet. You're going to have to undo the rope and I'll hold onto this tree and tie it onto another rope to a tree lower down. He managed to find his way down to a path, and some locals in the area we're in, they sort of had found this wheelchair with nobody in it early in the morning and taken it off to their little village to work out what on earth has happened. And we had to pay a ransom of 125 rupee, I can't remember what the currency was, 125,000, it was like it was about £8 or something, to get this wheelchair back, and it had survived the downhill bouncing down this cliff, and it was at the bottom, paid the ransom to the locals, then got it back, and thing carried on. That's a very extreme situation. That doesn't often happen. I quite like the challenge of being in that sort of situation of like, okay, what would we do if we hadn't have got that back?
Yeah.
Your mind starts racing to what would happen with it. Does that travels over? Could we get to Australia somehow with a borrowed wheelchair and manage to buy a new one somehow?
Yeah.
A thing that I really like about the adventure travels is that you have situations like that, and hopefully they all end up with a funny story at the end. But it's those funny stories that make for the interest and make for the real feeling that you're pushing yourself out there. And I quite like to be in that environment and try and work out the problems. So far, they've all ended fairly well, even though some of them were fairly extreme.
And yeah, certainly a story after that. I love how
Wow.
I love how you still remember the word for wheelchair as well.
Yes.
After all of these years, it was such a moment in
Yes.
in your life.
I think
So-
the most interesting bit was when we could hear it bouncing down the cliff in the darkness still, and we just sort of looked at each other with the realization of what this potentially could mean in those few seconds for the rest of the trip.
yeah, we've got a problem
Yeah.
here. Yeah. To say the least. Suzanne, I'm still slightly awestruck by that story, and I suppose
It makes everything I do seem so tame. My worst disasters are nothing compared to that.
but it's a really important point to make, actually, that, because travel is so individual, right? And Rob, your stories are extreme, they're epic, they're stories that I'd love to hear. But adventure is so different to everyone. And I think it's important to remember, because I suppose to many, actually, that's kind of quite overwhelming and people wouldn't necessarily want to put themselves in that. However, love hearing that story. Bring it back to like kind of equipment and things like that. How different bits of kit can be really enabling when you're traveling and going abroad and going on those adventures. Suzanne, are there any bits of kit that you use?
I would be lost without my tri-ride. That is critical for me traveling. I think it enables so much freedom and independence having some kind of attachment to your wheelchair, which gives you that extra battery power boost. I've got one of the travel ones, the folding ones, which makes it a lot easier to travel with. And it can do quite a lot of off-road stuff. It does a lot more than I expect it would be able to do. It's also super useful, just if you're in a town or a city as well. So for me, that is crucial. And then I have a couple of tech bits which aren't very hardcore but are very important. So I really struggle with the cold. I get very cold very easily, so I have a heated hoodie. I'm actually wearing it now. I actually find it most useful on an aeroplane. I get very cold on planes, and I'm the type of person, once I get cold, I feel like I'm never going to get warm again. So having something like that means that I feel better, especially because I love being outside as well. It's sort of that safety net of, do you know what, it's okay, I'm not going to get really cold. Having spinal injuries, you have silly little things to think about like that. And for me, the cold is one of them. Another thing I have is a portable phone charger thing. You just clip on the back of your phone. Again, I think things like that, which are just a bit of a safety net. I worry that my phone might run out of battery, and what if I'm stranded somewhere? I'm a little bit of a catastrophizer. Rob's story gave me chills because that I literally was like, oh my God, what would I do? I have no idea what I'd do in that scenario. So little things like that I have found kind of useful when I travel, of just easing the anxiety and making me feel like, do you know what, it's okay. I'm always going to have phone battery to, call someone if I need help, and I'm never going to be cold. I think they're probably not as vital as certain things. There's classic things like always making sure that I've got Allen keys or something. If something goes wrong, I've had brakes falling off my wheelchair, I've had punctures, obviously. An inner tube I always find is a very useful thing to have, because bike shops don't tend to have our wheelchair size inner tubes. Found that out the hard way in San Francisco. So just, things like that aren't necessarily big, bulky, but you can just sort of chuck in a suitcase and you just have that contingency plan there. But yeah, I am very much a catastrophizer, so I like to think of plans B, C, D, E, F, and all
Yeah.
the others.
Little things that make life more simple. For example, in the airports, I really struggle with my poor hand function to like get my passport and my boarding card out and all this kind of information that you need, your ticket and all the rest of it. So I used to have a bum bag, which has been around with the world with me numerous times now, and it is just like a little zip on the front. I can put it around my waist when I'm getting to the airport bit, and I can just get things really easily in and out of there at the airport, and it just saves that faff when everyone's queuing up behind you and you're getting annoyed because you can't get your documents out quickly. Just little things like that actually make travel life much more simple and much more relaxed because everything I need is in there. I can get to it quickly. And then I'll put it away when I'm not at the airport or when I don't need it. Also, little things like carrying some gaffer tape with you and little fixes and repairs and the toolkit and all the rest of it. Yeah, it does make a big difference.
Couple of zip ties and duct tape never go amiss, do they? Like, you never know when you're going to have to put them into action. I suppose I'm very similar in what I travel with, and I always have a little think about the location that I'm going to and just thinking what they may or may not have. I'm trying to take a couple of spares, but also there has to be a bit of that stepping slightly into the unknown whenever you're going out, of that reliance on the kindness of strangers. I was actually in Uganda recently and my chair broke. It had a crack in the frame. I was like, I absolutely horrified, right? The thought that actually my chair's broken and you're going to be stuck in something that you can't use at all. But actually, there was little motorbike shops on the side of the road, and they nearly all of them had welding equipment, and they were able to weld it back together and fix it so incredibly quickly that I barely kind of even realized that it happened, and it was no inconvenience. And I suppose was a nice bit of that story and that adventure piece as well. So it is having the faith of that kindness of strangers. You alluded to that a little bit earlier on, Rob, around actually there are so many people out there that are willing and really happy to support and help enable you when you are away in different cultures.
I think as well, it's interesting. I spent a year in China after my accident, and actually for some cultures, it really is part of their culture and their traditions to really look after people who use wheelchairs or, who have disabilities. And I think that's something to bear in mind with travel as well. I know it's slightly off topic, but for instance, in China, they insisted on pushing me around in my wheelchair, and it's not something I enjoy at all. But to them, they found it offensive if I didn't want to be pushed. And so I think, for instance, with your wheelchair breaking, it just is in their nature to help, to do all these things, to want to sort of help you. And potentially it's strange if it seems like we don't want help and we're sort of rejecting their kindness and everything. So I think, as Rob was saying earlier about asking for help and people wanting to help, I think it very much is actually, as much as we maybe want to be independent, we kind of need to realize that for some people it's actually offensive if we don't want their help or if we want to be independent.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the beauties of traveling, right? It's experiencing other cultures and being willing to actually properly step into the cultures. And we live in such an interconnected global world, and it's the learning and the curiosity that really kind of comes from those experiences that is sounds corny, but like the real beautiful bit of traveling, right? It's the bit that we miss out on if we're not willing to kind of step outside of our comfort zones a little bit and test ourselves. And I suppose we've heard like an awesome challenge from Rob when your chair fell down the hill and what you did to overcome it. Suzanne, would love to kind of hear any challenges that you've come across and like how you solve them when you're away. You mentioned around not being able to find an inner tube when you're in San Francisco, like the simple basic ones through to, I imagine you've got some slightly bigger ones.
Yeah, I think less extreme than Rob's. One sort of, not disaster. Again, I'm a catastrophizer, so I make it, in my head, I've made it out like this was a nightmare. It was not at all. When I look back on it, when I was in Yosemite, as I mentioned, I love outdoor sort of trails and stuff and figuring things out. And there's definitely been a few times where maybe Jack and I have bitten off more than we can chew with attempting a trail that we think might be accessible, and then this one in particular in Yosemite, we were going quite steep downhill, and I was like, I think this is going to be quite steep to get back up. And I think, I'm sure we've all been there. When you're going downhill, you're like, oh, this is fine, and you don't really think about the uphill. And then you kind of underestimate it. Anyway, we kept, the more we got down, he was like, it's fine. I wasn't so sure, but he was like, well, we've committed now, so like we may as well just go. Anyway, sure enough, on the way back up, Tri-Ride battery was running out very rapidly, and I was sort of doing the classic wheel spinning and everything. He was pushing me a bit, but he was like, this is pretty steep. I don't think this is smart. And there were sort of loads of people, everyone looking very weirdly at us. So we decided to abandon me, and he was going to walk back up to the top, find a ranger, and see if they could come and help us, because it was just about a drivable trail. I like to be very dramatic. I was abandoned at the bottom of this very steep trail in Yosemite. Loads of people walking past me like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, my friend's going to come down with the car." And they all looked at me like, you can't bring cars down here. And no phone signal because you're in the middle of the national park. And I was like, oh my God, it's going to get dark soon. There's going to be bears. All the people are going to leave and I'm just going to be stuck here and this is it. And like, what am I going to do? And, so I started thinking of every scenario. But after about an hour and a bit, sure enough,
No
Jack
bears.
came down with the ranger. No bears. Every little rustle in the bushes, I was like, this is it. This is a bear. I did get rescued. Because I am quite risk averse person. To me, that was really out of my comfort zone. Maybe to you guys and a lot of other people, they're like, that's literally nothing. That is just a sort of regular day. But I think, everyone does have very different comfort zones and different things. I don't like being by myself, without my phone or, a way to sort of contact people if something goes wrong. So I think, these things happen. And when I go in the sea, I don't like being by myself. I surf, but I don't like big waves. I don't like necessarily being by myself, which is hard because I compete in surfing. You have to be by yourself. So I think, everyone has got very different comfort zones and things that they find challenging. So I think, comparing one person's experience to another, I think can be quite detrimental. I think especially when we have spinal injuries, and so we're all very different and we all have different levels of comfort zone. But I think it's just so important to recognize that we all want to experience adventure and travel in some way, and it's just a case of whatever works best for you and whatever makes you get to the end of the day and be like, wow, that was cool, like that was a bit different, that was a great experience, whether it's good, bad, some good memories, some good stories. And I think that is the beauty of travel. And even if it's only going like an hour away, I live in Devon, me going out in the countryside here or exploring a new path here, I still consider that to be adventuring in some way, even though it may only be a couple of hours and then I'm back home on the sofa watching TV or something. I think that is still valuable experiences and valuable travel.
Making memories, isn't it? It's making
Memories, exactly.
And I have to ask, because you've mentioned it a couple of times around your surfing, where's your favourite place that you've surfed?
Before my accident, surfing was a big part of my life. I spent a month in Indonesia surfing, which was incredible. Since my accident, I'm part of the English para surf team, which is great. And I live down in Devon, so I'm near some very nice beaches here. And I do love surfing close to home. But I have also been fortunate to be at the World Surf Championships, which is in Huntington Beach in California. And surfing Huntington Beach with like only two other people in the water in your heat is pretty phenomenal. It's quite iconic with the pier there, so that's been pretty cool. And other places in Southern California, there are some phenomenal beaches there. But on my list is to go to Hawaii and surf. I would love to go somewhere with nice warm water and not have to get in and out of a wetsuit. So I do love surfing.
I love that. Thanks for sharing. And just thinking back to some of the challenges I've had, and I suppose they lap over with some of the other bits that we've chatted about. One of the things I had traveling through customs in India was having my chair taken away from me. And I was just popped on one of those plastic school chairs, and I managed to talk them into giving me my pressure cushion back after 5 or 10 minutes. But my chair was gone for like half an hour, 45 minutes, as they said they had to scan it and a whole other kind of plethora of things. And I got like pretty angry and irate initially, but then realized actually that wasn't going to get me my chair back any quicker. So it was trying to, through the language barrier, trying to explain the importance of having my chair and all of those kind of risks and things like that. And I think, yes, I got my chair back and it wasn't an issue. I didn't have any problems with skin or anything like that. But I suppose touches on some of those challenges around the kind of different education of disability and traveling to different cultures and environments where people maybe don't have that understanding or have a different approach to people with disabilities. And I think it's, for me, been very eye-opening, an incredible part of the travel experience to really kind of learn and experience that in different cultures. But would love to hear some of your experience of that. And Rob, I'll come to you first.
What immediately springs to mind is I did some voluntary work at a spinal injury unit in Bangladesh, and I travelled out there independently. And I think it was a real eye-opener to me. I've been in lots of different cultures where you quite often get looked at, and it's not rude to just literally just stare at someone wide, open-jawed as they push past. But I think particularly going to the spinal injury unit, being in central Bangladesh, where they were very amazed that a white Western person was still a wheelchair user. I think it was very much seen as Western medicine or modern expensive medicine could cure any condition or disability. And it was really interesting that they just didn't expect to see someone like myself pushing in a wheelchair and not having been cured in some way. And coupled with the fact that it not seem rude to just literally stare as you go past. So that's quite a cultural difference. And that was a really nice time. I think it was actually quite a benefit that I could actually go out there as who I am and being a wheelchair user and just say, look, we can't cure everything, but these are possibilities what you can still do. And it gave me a little bit more integrity going out there to show that most people who go out there to Bangladesh often aren't wheelchair users. So there's a lot of people who go and volunteer from the UK and Germany and various other countries to work out there for a while. But to actually have a wheelchair user doing that gave me so much more credibility. You know, you've got a language barrier to begin with, but they can just see, knowing their own experience of spinal injury and seeing that my experiences were similar, they could relate to me much more even through the language barrier. So that was really positive. That was a sort of a very different culture.
I've done a couple of things very similar, and I've always tell the story of going out, and I was actually, I think, in maybe 3,000 to 4,000 selfies through the day, and I felt like a celebrity for the day just because of that. I suppose it was that curiosity, right, of a white Westerner in a wheelchair was kind of a point of fascination. But I think it draws me back a little bit, what we've alluded to a couple of times through the conversation around perspectives and mindsets before you go into different cultures. And I think that's so incredibly important to do a little bit of research before you go anywhere and try and understand actually what are you going into to kind of have that right mindset. Because if I went to India with the mindset, just like, you know, when you went to Bangladesh, if you're expecting people to treat you as they do down in your local town, you would have had an awful experience, right? Because it would have been so far away from the perspective that you thought it would be. So that mindset piece before traveling, I think, is so important. Suzanne, what experience have you had of cultural disability understanding when you've been traveling?
Yeah, I think similar. Definitely when I was in China, people are pretty amazed by a blonde-haired woman in a wheelchair. Similar to both of you with that. I think even when I'm close to home and when I've been in the States surfing, you know, people seem amazed that a wheelchair user can surf, can get on a surfboard. And people ask me, oh my God, how I was doing a talk with Surfing England last year in Newquay and talking about the equipment, you know, just a general talk about para surfing. And then they had questions at the end, and a girl, she was quite young, put up her hand and she just looked at me and she said, "You're in a wheelchair, how can you surf?" And so I wonder how many other people do think that. I kind of love it that kids do just ask those questions because, you know, people do find it kind of amazing when we do extreme sports. And for us three, there's equipment, we figure out, you know, we know the ins and outs and we know what our bodies are capable of. And if you can lie down prone, face down on a board, then you can surf. You don't need to be able to stand up or kneel or sit on the board. I think people are often shocked and surprised that we are capable of doing a lot more than just sitting in our wheelchairs and being pushed around. And I think for me, that's so important that there are people like us and so many wheelchair users who are out about in the world doing things, experiencing things, showing what's possible. You know, partly why I love that so much can be shared on social media because the word gets out there and then more people are doing it. So I think social media can be a very bad thing, but I think it can be extremely positive. And scenarios like this, I think, are really cool to show there are ways that you can go on safari, you can do skydiving, you can do surfing and all these other extreme sports. And I think that's so cool and that's so important. And hopefully by doing this and having more accessible activities around the world, it does slightly shift cultures. I think we don't necessarily have to entirely change everyone's perception of what people with disabilities can do, but I think just slightly small things, having a bit more exposure, even things like the Paralympics, I think people are starting to recognize that people with disabilities can be athletes, they can, you know, have jobs, they can be powerful, all of these sorts of things. I think is so great. When I was injured 14 years ago to now, I think perceptions already have slightly shifted, and I think that is, I don't want to say exciting for people that are disabled, but you know, I think it's really nice that we aren't seen as vastly different to everyone else so much.
Yeah, I think you touch on something so important there. A lot of what adventure travel gives us is I suppose it shows us what we as individuals are capable of, right? I'm sure, Rob, you came back with a different viewpoint on what you were capable of and what your life would hold. Because I think if I reflect back to when I was lying in a hospital bed, I didn't know anyone with a disability beforehand, and I didn't realize that I had a negative view against people with a disability from what had been fed to myself. So it's about how do we push our barriers and show ourselves what we're capable of. And I think that's what's really exciting, because actually the legacy of the adventure is so much greater and can have such positive impacts to our whole life. So we've all shared some awesome travel experiences, some, I suppose, also some not so fun travel experiences, but I think that's kind of the joy of it, right? It's not all perfect when you go adventuring. And I suppose that takes me on to kind of what advice would you give to someone who was maybe nervous about adventure travel with a disability or with a spinal cord injury and is curious about it but is nervous? Suzanne, what would you say to that person?
I think probably two things. I think first thing is find your person or your people that you want to go with, like who makes you feel safe, who you really trust, that if you fall out of your wheelchair, they can help get you back in your wheelchair. If something goes wrong, that, you know, they're going to be the one that can help out. I think attempting solo travel to start with, I think is pretty daunting. I think you're brave to do that. That is the number one thing in my experience. And the second piece of advice is probably start closer to home. Maybe don't do a Rob and book 9 months backpacking as your first trip. Around the UK, you know, there's so many amazing places. There's so many amazing things to do that are in nature or a bit more adventurous. So maybe start with something that is a bit closer, something you can drive to, you know, doesn't have to involve, I know a lot of people find air travel pretty daunting. So maybe, you know, something that is not going to push you out of your comfort zone in every element and is maybe drivable of home, so that if something does go wrong or you feel very uncomfortable, you can just go back home, you can abandon it. You know, my very first trip after my accident, I attempted a girls' weekend in this little cabin a couple of hours from where my parents live. You know, I didn't realize that accessible means very different things. And what we thought was accessible was not accessible at all. There were steps to get in, the doorways were very narrow. And so, you know, that was extremely daunting. And we managed to sort of make something else work for the first night, but then we went home. It wasn't a massive catastrophe. I wasn't stranded, you know, in a different country and not knowing what to do. So maybe start closer to home and just dabble, get your feet wet, and then see how you like it.
I think you can always plan for the things that might go wrong, but I think you just need to accept that some things will go not according to plan and just have an attitude to go with the flow. You can try and work out whatever eventuality will be and plan to the nth degree, but to be a little bit flexible is a good thing. If you can be a little bit calm about that, realize that was just going to happen in life. Some of the things that I've managed to do have been due to things not going well or not going as I planned them, and they ended up being really interesting and different alternatives. And I think you just have to sort of go with an attitude of trying to do the best you can, trying to plan for things, trying to put yourself a bit out of your comfort zone, be open to the idea that things going not according to plan is not always the worst situation, and you might meet new people, you might have new experiences, you might push yourself. That might be the best situation. You know, just as a small example from our travels, we hoped to go from Thailand to Cambodia, and there was loads of floods happening, and a similar situation when I was traveling in South America. You know, we wanted to go to Machu Picchu and there was a load of floods happening there, so plans had to change, and the thing that we had planned to do couldn't happen, so we ended up doing other things. But that was also just as good and gave us other interesting stories and things that we ended up doing which were just as good as what we would have planned, but just different. So just be open to plans changing and having the attitude from yourself that just because plans change doesn't necessarily mean that plans are worse.
Setting your own expectations as well. You're not going to have your home comfort, so you are probably going to come back a little bit more exhausted. It is a bit harder, but the memories you make, the stories that you have afterwards, hopefully make it worthwhile.
For the people who are influencers, whether they're disabled travellers or just general, all of those lovely, amazing photos and videos that they put up aren't always exactly what they look like, and they've probably had a terrible time. They're really tired, got bitten to bits by mosquitoes and all the rest of it, but they put this thing up on social media that looks amazing. So just bear in mind, if you're having a great time, there will be hardships along the way and it will be a bit more difficult, but you know, everyone's stuff they put on social media is not exactly what it looks like in real life.
There's a deeper message there, isn't there, Rob?
Yeah, there is indeed.
Give me the sell. What do people get from this? Like pushing themselves out their comfort zone and new experiences and testing themselves. What do people get from it?
I think just expanding your horizons is just always amazing. Not just necessarily the places that you see, It's the people that you meet along the way, whether they're the locals or the other people that you're traveling with, or whatever it is, just the environment that you're in. Just having the experience of the world expanded is always a positive, I think. And some of that may be, I don't like this, I've experienced it and I don't like it. I like what I have when I go back home. And that is just as much valid, because sometimes coming back and seeing the green fields of England in the summer and the way things works, around here compared to the way things work in other countries is also a positive. The coming back part of it also is a benefit, as well as going to the other places that might be amazing scenery. But I think just expanding your horizons geographically and culturally and experiences of people and how they react in the world is great for your life in general. Should be always be encouraged.
Yeah, and Suzanne?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Rob. I think all of us with spinal injuries, we've been through something pretty traumatic and realize like, wow, life is pretty fragile, it's pretty precious. So actually, I think travel is a great way to embrace life and to realize like you don't know what's around the corner, you don't know what we all have in store for ourselves. So actually embracing these new opportunities, everyone deserves the chance to travel and to explore the world, because it is so fulfilling and so exciting, and there is incredible people to meet and things to see. So I like to think all of us who've sustained a spinal injury, whether it was through an accident or injury, whatever it was, we do have that slight perspective of, wow, things can change in an instant. So I have to make the most of today. I have to make the most of whatever opportunity I have, whether that is getting to go backpacking, whether that is just going on a local countryside walk, or just something that kind of pushes you slightly out of your comfort zone. And I think it is harder for us having sustained injuries where we do maybe feel like we want to wrap ourselves up in cotton wool a little bit more, but actually it's so good for us mentally to push ourselves a little bit and remind ourselves that some of the most fun things and some of the best things are when you do slightly push yourself, and you can live a very sheltered life, but is that as fulfilling as sort of pushing yourself slightly out of your comfort zone? Not way out. I think there's like boundaries to test with and play around with, but yeah.
It shows you what you're capable of, right? It kind of tests our own presumptions on what we think we as individuals are capable of, right? And I think that has such knock-on advantages for the rest of our lives as well. And you mentioned around that, Rob, coming back after trips, right? And actually there's all of that carry on, and with your own individual perspective changing, like how have you seen adventure travel actually impact your life on a grand scale?
I think just immediately after coming back from backpacking trips and stuff, it really has changed my sort of perspective, because when you're backpacking, you just generally talk to whoever's next to you. And then you come back into, real normal life in the UK, and the person in front of you in the queue for the post office doesn't expect you to strike up a conversation with them. It's just not generally the done thing. But actually, it's kind of nice to sort of be challenged in that way a little bit, and to sort of challenge the cultures and be a little bit more open to making new connections and talking to new people. And now I've been back in the UK for a long time, I haven't done much adventure travel, and I've in a very, very different situation with my family. Again, you sort of withdraw back into what you're used to and become a little bit, I don't know, just do the same sort of things all the time. And with the other things I do, I run my business and I do a lot of sport and stuff as well, and I've got my family. That's fine, and that's good to be back to that norm. And there's things that you have to do for earning money and all the rest of it and looking after the family. But to be challenged and brought out of yourself a little bit now and again kind of has that knock-on effect that you end up taking those challenges in life that maybe you wouldn't have taken before, or you are open to new opportunities that maybe you would have been a bit scared of otherwise, because you've experienced that in the way that you've sort of run your life when you've done your travels and pushed yourself out your comfort zone a bit. That has a knock-on effect, which I think is good for us all.
And I think like by widening that sphere and stepping outside that sphere, everything else gets bigger, right? Because of the travels I've been on, I am less likely to kind of create an excuse of why I can't do something. Whether that's as simple as being like, oh, I can't take the bins out. I'm like, actually, I've gone and done this crazy travel. I can take the bins out. Even those really simple daily tasks, right? I think it does impact it all. Suzanne, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I completely agree. You don't realize how much of an effect the travels that you've been on have on your everyday life in a positive way. You maybe feel more independent to go to Tesco's by yourself or something. Because you're living the everyday, you don't necessarily realize it, that you've sort of had that shift, or you felt more confident to do something more independently. But I think it is probably noticeable to other people. I've had my surf instructors say in the past, because in competitions, I have to surf by myself, and I have to make all the decisions in the water of what wave I'm going to take. If it's a big wave, do I abandon my board? Do I swim through it? Whatever I do. And so when I'm in training here, I've always got someone with me, and so you can be a bit more afraid if you've got someone there that's sort of your safety net. But when you're by yourself, you have to figure things out for yourself. You have to be more independent, be more courageous. And so as a result of in these competitions, it means that when I am back in training or when the waves are a bit bigger, my coach can be like, you've done this, you've done this sort of already, you can do this by yourself, so just get on with it. And so I think having these experiences in your memory box of things that you have done, you can just remind yourself like, oh no, do you know what? I can do this. I've got this. I've done worse. I've done more wilder things than this. And I think that is so important, just to make sure you are always progressing and making the most out of life.
I'm obviously biased, but I'm sold. Adventure travel is brilliant. But I think the one question that I think is probably burning is, how do we do it on a budget? Is it possible to even do adventure travel on a budget with a disability? There's a lot that needs to be taken into account. And Rob, I'm going to come to you.
It definitely is possible. Everyone's got a different budget, really, haven't they? So there are ways to get around things. There are ways to find ways to travel, whether that's flights and backpacker accommodation or hostels or whatever it is. Now, when I travel abroad with the family, we often go in a motorhome. When it was just me and my wife, it was, we called it a camper van. It was a camper van and it was a lot more cooler. But now we've actually decided we've got a motorhome. It's bigger and it's got a little bit more luxuries. But we've got a family of 4, so that's what's needed. But we can now travel to some of the places that we probably wouldn't be able to afford if we were going to fly and stay in a nice hotel and have to eat out every time. We've travelled through quite a few places in Europe, and I think this year our plan is to go we got to go up to a wedding up north, and then we're going to get a ferry over to Holland and drive through Holland and Belgium and France, and then come back through Calais. But just staying in campsites, you can cook for yourself, you can find ways to do travel, to do the entertaining part of travel is a bit cheaper. It certainly is a possibility. Everyone has a different budget and everyone has different levels of the kind of like what they find acceptable to compromise on luxury and cost wise. But there are always ways of doing it.
Thinking about campsites, like I also have a van that we've converted. Campsites in Europe are pretty accessible for the most part from kind of what I've experienced, and you can find out all that information online. And as I mentioned before, I like to have a toilet, right, and a bathroom. And the campsites in Europe have actually always come through with the goods as such. So that whole kind of traveling by road, love a road trip, love kind of experiencing the world in that way. And Suzanne, I don't know if you kind of have any tips.
Obviously there's something for every budget, and if you're going on a massive trip, you need to expect that it is going to be fairly pricey, but there are ways to make it a bit cheaper. I think for me, as I've already said, accommodation is so important, and I would rather spend a bit more on that to have something where I have the privacy, the good bathroom, that kind of thing. And then when it comes to activities, I think there's loads out there that's cheap or free, just sort of being out in nature, going for walks, that kind of thing can be free or sort of minimal cost. In the US, because I've spent a lot of time there, the national parks I think are incredible. They are so accessible, and you often just pay, a small entry fee, and then you're in and you can spend an entire day there. You can spend several days just sort of exploring. So there's ways to think about where your priorities are on a trip and where you want to sort of spend money. Similar for me is food. I don't feel the need to splash out a lot on food. If I'm staying in a hotel somewhere, you can make yourself a little lunch with the breakfast food there. There's just ways, or you can go to a supermarket and just make sandwiches for lunch. You don't have to eat out for every meal. Definitely ways to bring the cost down a little bit. If there are non-negotiables, like a flight abroad is often quite expensive, especially if we have to take lots of luggage and stuff. There are ways to cut down on other parts of the trip. So I think that is what I tend to do, is just sort of look at everything and look at like, where am I happy to spend money, and then where can I sort of cut some costs? Things that are closer to home or things that are drivable. I really like that. I love mini breaks or little things. If I had kids, I'm sure I'd have a van as well, or a motorhome.
Like you were saying before, for that individual maybe stepping into adventure for the first time, having that flexibility of having a vehicle for those first few trips is brilliant, because it does give the opportunity to have more kit that you take with you, but also that opportunity to press the eject button and get back to wherever you want to be. So just the last couple of questions. What's your next adventure, Rob?
Next adventure is probably one I just talked about with the kids through Europe. I travel a bit with work as well, and
Yeah.
with my racing. So I'm a wheelchair racer. So I'm also hoping to do probably 2 weeks in the US in the summer, where I'll do 3 races, a marathon and a couple of shorter races. And I'll probably try and stay somewhere as cheap as possible between those so that I don't have to, I can do all 3 races. And travel for me now as an adventurer is actually getting my racing wheelchair through a number of airports without it being damaged, and on and off vehicles to get it to the race in top condition. And so that's kind of what I've got planned for the moment. And then, like I was talking about, the motorhome trip through Europe in the summer.
Love that. And Suzanne?
I'm actually heading off to San Francisco in a couple of days, which is a work trip, but always looking to sort of combine some exploration as well. So I think there's some amazing parts of California to explore, sort of in Northern California. So I think I'm going to spend a few days doing that. That's sort of immediately on the horizon. But in terms of my next sort of bucket list trip, or what I really want to do, as I mentioned before, surfing and going to Hawaii or Costa Rica, where there's some nice warm water, is definitely on my list. Although I didn't realize Costa Rica has got giant spiders, which is quite off-putting for me. As part of my job, I spend hours and hours looking at beautiful, accessible accommodation all around the world. In particular, there is this phenomenal treehouse in Brazil. I think you mentioned it at the top of the pod, which is super accessible in the rainforest, and I love the idea of something like that. There's also this phenomenal chalet in Nova Scotia, which I have been eyeing up for a few years because it is just surrounded by nothing and no one and scenery. And so, yeah, looking at beautiful, accessible accommodation in unique locations or in the middle of nowhere is what gets me very excited to book and do something like that.
And it's those places that are often presumed that someone with a disability can't get to. I think those are like the really extraordinary bits, right?
Yeah,
Like Nova
exactly.
Scotia or the middle of the Amazon or something like
Yeah,
that. I
exactly.
absolutely love that.
Quite often with them, not only they're accessible, they're also beautifully accessible as well. I think accessible can be beautiful as well as functional as well as unique. And so when you have that kind of trifecta all coming together, for me, that is the ultimate, and that is what is worth, booking that flight, booking that trip, planning, and getting so excited about it, rather than like, this is, all right. I like that kind of thing.
Sometimes things are very much surprisingly accessible, I've found as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of the places I've been in less developed countries don't have things like pavements and drop curbs and all the rest of it, but people just push in the road, and car travellers expect to see people going slowly and weirdly in roads because there's loads of carts and various things like that. And I was just reminded by your talking about Brazil, we went to Iguazu Falls, and often those nature-based kind of activities sometimes can be quite difficult to be accessible. But actually the access around Iguazu, we went to the Argentinian side, but there's also a Brazilian side, was really good. There was flat walkways where you could get right up on top of the falls, and they were really well done in that you couldn't see them in your photos because they were kind of nicely obscured, but you could get right to where everyone else could in the falls. The wheelchair access was amazing. So if you get to that part of Brazil, then I would recommend Iguazu Falls for the access and amazing photos.
I'm coming to you for all travel tips because it seems like you have been everywhere. So
right.
Expect to hear more from me.
It's going to be a long list by the end of that conversation. That's the only problem, isn't it? That's the only problem. So coming with my last question, in one word or sentence, what does traveling with confidence mean to you? Rob?
Traveling with confidence, I think it's just putting yourself out there and enjoying the bits that go well and the bits that don't go well, and realizing that both of those things are amazing sometimes, and that you will gain experience and some good, interesting stories and some life challenges and developments from whatever happens, really.
That wasn't one word, Rob.
That wasn't one word. I think it wasn't one word, it was one sentence. Anyway, just to enjoy whatever happens, because it'll be positive for your life, whatever.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. And Suzanne?
Well, now that I know that I can have a whole sentence. No, the one word that sprung to my mind when you said it, and then Rob did an entire sentence. I was going to say fulfilling. I think it's incredibly fulfilling.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to both of you for your time. I know you're both very busy people, so we really, really appreciate it. We really value your stories. Thank you for listening to Access All Areas, SIA's Travel and Mobility podcast. If you'd like to find out more, click the link below and don't forget to follow us on social media. This podcast is made possible by funding from the Motability Foundation. Please